everyone, I am back for the next reading session for today. So let's continue our story. Wednesday the 3rd of April 1912, St Abernathy's Orphanage for Girls, the Whitechapel. Today I went back into the city to meet my new employer again. This time I was allowed to go by myself, although I was given many instructions by the sisters and warned to keep the small change they had given me hidden in different pockets, so I will be safe from thieves. I have a bit of experience with thieves, but I'm quite certain I have never known a thief, nor so much as seen one from a distance. The dress I wore was an unflattering cut, an even worse shade of dull maroon. A postulant who did not do well in the orphanage atmosphere and was transferred to a more traditional convent had left it behind with a bundle of other unfortunate but earthly dresses. I don't remember her, but it was clear from the dimensions of the dress that she had been tall and not slim. Sister Judith and Sister Catherine performed some necessary surgery with great handfuls of pins, and warned me not to move about freely, if possible. But what if I meet a thief and must take flight? I asked. Their reignited concern about just that dreadful possibility eliminated the chorus of chuckles that I had anticipated. So it was off to Claridge's once again. There might have been a more direct way to go, but I repeated our exact motor bus ride in order to enjoy another walk through Piccadilly Circus. But I resisted buying any food, as I suspected plenty would await me at the hotel. After all, tea time approached. I had hoped we would meet in the foyer, so I could enjoy listening to that quartet again, but Mrs. Carstairs had a servant downstairs awaiting my slightly late arrival. He escorted me up to her suite, where our tea was to be served privately. I was concerned that my table manners had not passed previously, but then caught sight of two fluttery young women clutching measuring tapes, pincushions, and the like. I had, of course, forgotten that I was to be fitted with appropriate garments. Florence was stalking back and forth in front of the two women, letting out a fierce growl every so often. This was making the women uneasy, to say the least. "Hello, Florence," I said. She wagged her tail at me, then resumed her feisty strut. I could not tell how large the suite was, because so far I had only seen the hallway, and it appeared palatial. Mrs. Carstairs came bustling out, looking both more and more unwieldy than I remembered. Judging from her widened eyes when she saw me and ran her eyes up and down my lumpy dress, I was more obviously working class than she had remembered. "Good afternoon, Margie," she said, quite brisk. Margie? But I greeted her very pleasantly regardless, and by the proper name even. She waved her hand at each of the two pale, jittery ladies in turn. "This is Hortense and Mabel. Please be most cooperative with them." She turned to the women. "As you can well see, this is a dire situation." I followed them into a sun-splashed sitting room where a grand tea was spread out on a lace-covered table by the broad sparkling windows. A man with sparse white hair but thick grey mutton-chop whiskers was seated at the table, reading a newspaper and clearing his throat ever so often. "Frederick," Mrs. Carstairs said, "this is Margaret Jane Brady, the girl who will be accompanying me." "Jane?" Mr. Carstairs noticed us then, and stood up with a bow. Yes, so glad to see you," he said, with a patient but vague smile. I was relieved that he didn't want to shake hands, or otherwise be demonstrative. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir," I said, although I was tempted to call him Governor just to hear everyone gasp. Her clothes are very common, but I think she will do nicely, Mrs. Carstairs said. Don't you agree, Frederick? Mr. Carstairs nodded heartily, although his gaze was still lingering on his newspaper. Yes, lovely, lovely. Splendid, I volunteered. He looked up. Yes, splendid. I am to have her fitted now, Mrs. Carstairs said. Right out in the open? We're Americans. That strange. I sensed a spot of alarm coming from Mr. Carstairs' direction as well, but Mrs. Carstairs was already ushering me into a small dressing room, crowded with more fancy clothes than I had ever seen in one place. And oh, the shoes, so many glossy, impractical shoes. Be thorough, Mrs. Carstairs instructed Hortense and Mabel. When they are finished, Margie, you may join us for tea. I despised nicknames, but suspected that pointing this out would make no impression whatsoever. Hortense and Mabel had a great deal of trouble unpinning me from my dress. Although they were shop girls and certainly not society ladies, my appearance seemed to offend them, and they exchanged more than one wince. I ignored this, except for mimicking one of Florence's snarls once, just to see them flinch. After they had finally completed their oddly complex measurements, with muttered comments to each other, they undertook the not inconsiderable challenge of repinning me into my dress. Did you pick this out yourself? One of them, I think it was Mabel, finally asked. Yes, quite so, I said. It fell off the back of the quaintest little lorry in Whitechapel. They gave each other knowing glances, and regarded me with somewhat more sympathy than before. Once they had finished the pinning and been shown out by a hotel maid, I found I could move even less freely than had previously been the case. Sitting down promised to be a challenge. However, I was up to the challenge if I could then tuck into that appetising array on the tea table. My dinner of bread and jam felt like a memory from my distant past. Mr. Carstairs rose to his feet when I came in, and I sat down as swiftly as possible, a small shower of pins escaping in my wake. Neither of my tea companions commented upon this, although Mrs. Carstairs at least noticed, and frowned. I very much appreciate everything you are doing for me, Mrs. Carstairs, I said, very politely, and urge you not to go to too much trouble. Yes, well, she said, after the pause. Our conversation was stilted, and Mr. Carstairs did little more than nod or grunt occasionally. I found it appalling that he was drinking coffee, but other than that, he seemed like a pleasant, if somewhat stodgy chap. Both of them fed Florence tempting tidbits at every opportunity, and she took turns sitting in their laps. Once in a while she visited me as well, and I would present her with a nibble of ham or chicken. She seemed to dislike watercress. What a wonderful hotel this is, Mrs. Carstairs, I contributed at one point. Obviously, I should rather be at the Savoy, but she glanced at her husband. My Frederick prefers it here. It turned out that they had theatre tickets that night and reservations at a restaurant called Romano's, so soon it was time for me to take my leave. Mrs. Carstairs reminded me again and again that I was to return on Tuesday morning, packed and ready to go. We would be taking the train to Southampton and sailing the very next day. Each time she went over the plans, I felt shivers of excitement, but fear. Mr. Carstairs said it had been capital, just capital to meet me. I agreed. Mrs. Carstairs went over our schedule one last time, and finally I gave Florence a pat and headed off. Then I paused by the door. So, I am to return on Wednesday evening? I said, just for fun. Mrs. Carstairs' face went so pale that I suddenly felt a bit alarmed. But all she said was, "You are a very impudent girl, Margie." I graciously agreed with this observation. and left. I'm going to leave it there because that is the end of that day. But hopefully next time we will find out what happens when she does get to Southampton on the Tuesday. Brilliant. Well, thanks for listening, guys, and I will be back again tomorrow. See you later.